Number 10. The Norfolk and Western K-Class. Now, the first batch of K-Classes were built between 1916 and 1917. They were numbered 100 to 115, with a boiler pressure of 200 psi, a driving wheel diameter of 70 inches. They had 57,100 pounds of tractive effort. Then, between 1919 and 1923, 20 more engines were built, and they were classified as K2s, number 116 to 137. Then finally, 10 more engines were built, number 200 to 209, classified as K3s. Now, the K3s were stronger than the other two classes, having a 69,813 pounds of tractive effort because of the increased boiler pressure. The K2s had a boiler pressure of 220 psi, unlike the K1s. The K3s, however, had smaller driving wheels than the other two engines. They were used for mixed traffic, which means they could haul passenger trains and freight trains. Later in their career, some of the K-classes were even partially streamlined, having the same streamlining as the famous J-class 484 Northerns. Later in their career, some of the K-classes were sold off to a railroad that I cannot really pronounce. The remainder of the K-class worked on the NNW until 1957, when all of them started to be retired. Sadly, by 1959, all the K-classes were cut up for scrap.
Number 9. The New York Central L4 Mohawks. Now, I know some of you are going to mention New York Central number 3001, but 3001 here is a L3A, not an L4. Even though these two classes of locomotives look very similar, they have some slight differences between them. Before I talk about the differences between the L3s and the L4s, let's go into the history. Around the time of World War II, the New York Central needed a new steam engine to haul freight trains and passenger trains at high speeds to help out with the war effort. The result was in 1940 of 65 engines being numbered 3000 to 3064, and they were classified L3As, L3Bs, and L3Cs. And all of them were built by the American Locomotive Company. But then, in 1942, the New York Central ordered 50 L4 Class 482 Mohawks from the Lima Locomotive Works. First, there's 25 L4As, numbered 3100 to 3124. Then, finally, 25 L4Bs were numbered 3125 to 3149. Now let's talk about the differences between 3001 and the L4s. Since 3001 is an L3A, all L3A locomotives had roller bearings. The L4s had roller bearings as well. However, unlike the L3As, which were all built with box-box style drivers, the L4s were either built with box-box or skull and disc drivers. Another difference was the driver diameter. The L3As, except number 3000, had 69-inch drivers, while the L4s had 72-inch drivers. These 50 Mohawks were used to pull freight trains and passenger trains up until the diesel started to take over in the late 40s and the early 1950s. Even though Mohawks 3001 and 2933 were spared, the L4s were retired between 1954 and 1957, and then set off for scrapping.
Number 8. The Southern Pacific GS2. The most famous Southern Pacific steam locomotive is the GS class, also known as Golden State or General Service. The GS2 was the first streamlined GS class 484. These engines were built by the Lima Locomotive Works in 1937. 6 of these were built, numbers 4410 to 4415. The Southern Pacific named Daylight has its beginnings dating back to early 1937, when on March 21st, it was inaugurated as an all-streamlined passenger train serving Los Angeles and San Francisco. Up front was a GS2 484 pulling B train. The GS2 pulled the Daylights from 1937 until 1941. During World War II, they were painted black and silver and were used to transport troops. In the 1950s, their side skirts were removed for easier maintenance, and the locomotives were assigned to general service, hence the name, pulling such trains as the San Jose-San Francisco commutes, the Coast Mail, and freight service. By 1958, all engines, all 6 of them, were sadly cut up for scrap. The GS2 was very revolutionary. If it wasn't for that, we would never have number 4449 or 4460, even though that one never pulled the daylight service in its career.
Number 7. Santa Fe number 3829. This is the only one-off engine on this list. What we have here is the first ever 210-4 Texas type ever built in the United States. Now before I continue with this, I just want to say that the 3829 is part of the 3800 class, but it's not a 210-2. It's a 210-4 Texas type, unlike the 3800s. Let's now go into the history of the 3829. In 1919, the Santa Fe ordered 76 210-2s built by Baldwin. However, 75 of this class were 210-2s. As for 3829, the engine was added with a 4-wheel trailing truck, and it was the only 210-4 out of the 3800 series, with a boiler pressure of 215 pounds per square inch, and 63-inch diameter driving wheels, and 30 by 32-inch cylinders. The 3829 could produce 83,543 pounds of tractive effort. 3829 was used for heavy freight trains and occasional passenger trains on the Santa Fe Railroad. But because of the advent of the diesel locomotive, the 3829's career was cut short. 3829 was retired in 1955 and scrapped 4 years later. Even though 3829 was scrapped, we have 5 other 210-4 Texas types from the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe still around today.
Number 6. The Union Pacific Early or Fetter Challengers. So, in the mid-1930s, the Union Pacific needed a new locomotive to haul heavy freight and passenger trains at high speeds. So, in 1936, someone by the name of Arthur H. Feather designed a locomotive with a 4664 wheel engine called the Challengers. In total, 40 of these amazing locomotives were built between 1936 and 1937, numbered 3900 to 3939. With a boiler pressure of 280 psi and a driving wheel diameter of 69 inches, these locomotives can produce 97,305 pounds of tractive effort, which is very impressive. They were just perfect for hauling freight and passenger trains over the Wasatch Mountains. During the 1940s, the Challengers were reassigned to the Flatlands, and what took their place is the 4000 class of heavy freight locomotives. And later in their career, the Fetter Challengers were renumbered to 3800 to 3839 because the new heavy Challengers started taking over. Eventually, the diesels took over all their assignments. The early Challengers were retired between 1957 and 1958. Even though 3977 and 3985 was spared, none of the early Challengers were left, which is kinda sad. Even though I'm not a big fan of the Union Pacific, it would be cool to see at least a couple of these locomotives still around, but again, that's just me.